Um, Oh, hey, class. Lecture in the long 1960s. What are the long 1960s? Historians have kind of realized that the movements that began in the 1960s have significantly continued to shape the United States today. Also, the conflicts between those movements continue to shape the United States today. In many ways, what we call the culture wars is rooted in this decade. And so we understand the 1960s in some ways never really ended, but we're still fighting those fights. In fact, some people have said that you can determine whether a person is a liberal or conservative based on how they answer the question, how do you feel about the 1960s? So let's get on with it. So there were a number of radical liberal movements, for lack of a better term, that's what we will refer to these movements, the radical liberal movements of the 1960s. And a lot of people, when they remember the 1960s, that's all they remember is a radical decade. We'll see in part 2 of this lecture that that's really not the case. The conservative movement was very much shaping during these years as well, too. But let's focus first on the radical liberal movements of these years. I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to read the Port Huron statement that is due for this week. Particularly, you can skim a lot of it, but focus in on the sections, the value section and the sections on participatory democracy. What I'm going to suggest is these different radical movements. It's not like they all read the Port Huron statement and said, that's what we need to do. It's just in their different ways, they're all expressing ideas that seem to be captured pretty well in the Port Huron statement itself. So you see on the far, at least on my left there, drop acid, not bombs. This is a picture of the New Left of the 1960s. The New Left, a couple things to understand about this is this was a transnational movement. There was a New Left in France, in England. And in fact, in many ways, the New Left began in England in 1958, and banned the bomb movement came to the United States first in a free speech movement, but the New Left was an international movement. It was predominantly in the United States white middle-class college students. The reason we call them the New Left is because they were centered in universities, whereas the Old Left was really centered in labor unions. One of the problems the New Left faced is that they never were quite able to connect with the working class in the way that the Old Left had been able to. Their relationship with labor unions was always tenuous, and so the New Left really found its center of gravity then, and in many ways today, in the universities. We call it the New Left. The students themselves has called it the movement, and even that's misleading because, in fact, there were movements. The student New Left was involved in free speech, in anti-nuclear weapons, in anti-poverty efforts. Eventually, the New Left around 1965 becomes centered in the anti-war movement, particularly the anti-Vietnam War movement. That's when the New Left really begins to explode and goes from being a couple hundred students around the country to hundreds of thousands of students protesting the war. The flagship of the New Left was a group called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. They were headed by Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden was the author of the Port Huron Statement. Again, just to highlight how small this movement was, when SDS in 1962 got together in Port Huron to kind of inaugurate the Port Huron Statement, there was 68 people there. It was a very small movement, and a lot of what they did in the early years was piggyback off of the civil rights movement. Nevertheless, these college students involved themselves in a variety of different causes. Eventually, SDS became the leading organizer of anti-war protests, and that's when SDS's numbers jumped from a couple hundred around the country to hundreds of thousands, and ultimately split after 1968. Of course, the civil rights movement was a foundational radical liberal movement of this time. You're familiar with Martin Luther King Jr. And the way that he kind of, after the Montgomery bus boycotts of 1955, how he kind of emerged as a spokesperson for the movement. But it's important to understand the civil rights movement. It didn't have a leader. King, maybe he thought of himself as a leader, but other civil rights leaders never recognized him in that role. In fact, they made it clear the civil rights movement didn't have a leader, it had leaders. And there was some significant infighting on how exactly the civil rights movement should be carried forward. You had King, who in many ways the civil rights strategy was kind of bringing national media attention around him, around his speeches, around his movements, and trying to build kind of a mass protest movement like the one that had freed India from British colonialism, trying to free African Americans, particularly in the South, from the colonialism of Jim Crow segregation, trying to free them through building a mass movement. And in many ways, it was recognized as a top-down movement centered largely in an organization, the SCLC, or the Student Christian Leadership Conference. I want to focus your attention a little bit more on kind of an alternative figure to King. That's the woman featured there, Ella Baker. Baker had, since the 1920s, been involved in civil rights organizing at a grassroots level. Had been a member of the NAACP through the 1940s and 1950s. Eventually left that organization. King and SCLC, when they form after 1955, they bring Baker back in, and she'll work with them till 1960, and then she leaves that organization. For Baker, she just fundamentally disagreed with the strategy of trying to build a movement around a single person, trying to build it around kind of the personality and the message of King. Baker's philosophy was strong people don't need strong leaders. That was her phrase. Strong people don't need strong leaders. And she was left the organization in 1960 looking to build a more grassroots, bottom-up civil rights movement. She will find college students, African-American college students in the South, who just kind of spontaneously in 1960 began engaging in sit-ins in Woolworths and other segregated lunch counters in the South. She sees this going on, and she tries to bring some coordination to it. So Baker will get together with these college students in 1960, and they will launch a new civil rights organization, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Largely with King's blessing, you can see it, and it's in the very title of this organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Right? King's message of mass nonviolent direct action was something that SNCC ultimately was committed to in 1960. At the same time, the word coordinating is where Baker and her strong people don't need strong leaders philosophy really comes in, with wanting African Americans to really mobilize themselves at a grassroots level rather than kind of rely upon a media celebrity like King. So SNCC are really the guerrilla warriors of the civil rights movement. It's SNCC members, and it's predominantly young people in SNCC, a lot of African Americans, but it's also a lot of new lefters too, like Tom Hayden or his wife Casey Hayden, who would travel to the South in the 1960s and engage in direct action and engage in coordinating. For a while, SNCC and the civil rights movement, SCLC and King, worked together. The way this would work is they would target a particular city in the South that they wanted to engage in direct action. And so in 1962, that was Selma. In 1963, that was Birmingham. SNCC would go in months in advance and do the coordinating work. They were the ones going door to door, trying to get African Americans to register to vote. A lot of African Americans didn't know that they had a right to vote. They would get them to register to vote. They would get them involved in citizenship schools, just teaching kind of basic rights that African Americans had, getting them prepared for direct action campaigns. And then at a designated time, King would come in, and when King came in, he brought the national and the world media with him to kind of publicize his protest. And so this kind of top-down, bottom-up movement met first in Selma in 1962. The idea was to pressure the white establishments of these cities to honestly, to act violently. I mean, we think of the civil rights movement nonviolent, right? The reality is the civil rights movement civil rights leaders understood that they needed to get white people to behave badly, and they needed to get that on camera, and that would really bring about change, because it would pressure the powers that be, namely in this case the Kennedy administration against the Lyndon Johnson administration, to have to act, right? I mean, America's fighting a Cold War at this time. How can the United States pretend to be the leader of the free world, the champion of democracy in the world, while they deny basic democratic rights to African Americans, where they allow white people to just violently suppress African American rights? So the civil rights movement is all about trying to capture white violence on film. This doesn't happen in Selma in 1962. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen in Birmingham in 1963 until, in a desperation move, the civil rights leaders there start a second march, a children's march, in which they put children at the front lines. In this case, the white power establishment of Birmingham at that time, they do act on that. They turn fire hoses and dogs on kids. These pictures are captured and broadcast over the United States, over the world. John F. Kennedy will have to go on the news that night and say race has no place in American life or law, and commit himself to a robust civil rights package. Kennedy and his brother Robert, John Kennedy and his brother Robert, were very reluctant. I mean, they wanted to fight the Cold War. They wanted to beat the communists. They weren't interested in civil rights, especially since still a large part of the Democratic Party at that time were segregationist white Southerners. They really didn't want to take this issue up, but African Americans forced them to do so, and it was through this coordination of SNCC and LCLC working together. So 1963, Birmingham, which brings about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They do the same thing in Selma in 1965. They get the Voting Rights Act. Those are kind of the high points of the civil rights movement. But during these same years, the civil rights movement is fragmenting. Particularly SNCC members are getting frustrated. They're the ones facing the violence. They are the ones getting murdered. And they are the ones who in 1964, after they had done a lot of coordinating work in Mississippi, went to the Democratic National Convention that year. Kennedy had been assassinated by this point. It's Lyndon Johnson who is the president at this time. They go to the DNC fully expecting that Johnson and the Democrats will advance civil rights, particularly in light of what had happened in Birmingham. And what they find is that Johnson and the DNC are they're trying to hold the Democratic Party together. Yes, there are a lot of Democrats, particularly Northern, Midwestern, who want to support more robust civil rights, but there's still, the Democratic base is still in the segregationist South. And so Johnson makes it pretty clear, we're not really going to support your cause at this time. SNCC members, that was kind of the final straw, the final betrayal for them. And after 1964, we see a couple of shifts for them. One, in 1965, SNCC will kick out all of its white college student members. It becomes an all-black movement at that time. And two, they finally begin to break from the nonviolent strategy. It's not that they are about coordinating violence. That's how this time is sometimes remembered, is that African Americans shifted from nonviolence to inflicting violence on white people. That was never the case. They shifted to self-defense. That rather than just take violence from white communities, we should defend our communities against persistent white violence. These breaks, particularly within SNCC, will culminate in 1965 and 1966 with the formation of the Black Power movement. And you see one of the there in the middle of your screen, the kind of the intellectual spokesperson, kind of what King was for the civil rights movement. This individual was for Black Power. His original name was Stokely Carmichael, and he was a member of SNCC. He had been at the DNC in 1964, and he had led SNCC into the new era of Black Power, changing his name to Kwame Ture at the time. If you've heard this name before, it's because one of your books for the class, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, was co-authored by Ture. You'll see, some of you will be able to see, I know a few of you are going to read the Thomas Kuhn book, but a number of you will see kind of Stokely Carmichael's vision for Black Power expressed in that book. King would call Black Power a slogan without a program. That was King's words. See when you read the Ture book, Black Power, if that's appropriate or not. Whether Black Power really was as destructive as a force as it's sometimes remembered to be. I think, I don't know if you've even, when you were in high school, even your coach even talked about Black Power or not. Usually if Americans do, it's usually civil rights movement good, Black Power bad. Civil rights movement peaceful, Black Power movement angry, uncontrolled, violent. There is some truth to that. But to call Black Power a slogan without a program, I don't know. I'm going to let you guys decide. We'll talk about that in the future. So the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers ultimately stemming is an expression of that movement. So I'll let you read about that. We'll talk about Black Power in the future. Breaking off from the civil rights movement, from the Black Power movement, and from the New Left, you had there up in the corner, you see NOW, National Organization for Women. They formed in 1966, the flagship of so-called second wave feminism within the United States, the first wave occurring in the 19th century and within the suffrage movement. Feminists since World War I had really kind of struggled with what's the way forward. Do we argue for special protections for women? Do we argue for equal rights for women? And they had struggled through World War II and into the 1950s. Now in 1966, building upon the success of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and I should say Friedan was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women, their answer would kind of be both. We're going to argue for policies unique to women, such as nationalized daycare, nationalized health insurance. Absent some national health policy, who does caring for the sick and elderly in a household, who does that ultimately fall upon? That falls upon women predominantly. And so the second wave feminism thought of nationalized health care as something that was uniquely a woman's issue. But also equal rights as well too, such as equal pay legislation, equal opportunity for employment are all things that NOW would be fighting for. NOW in its early years and its founding, honestly, a lot of the feminists would be considered conservative feminists by later standards. Many pro-life feminists, for instance, the abortion issue was not one that they wanted to take up. It will be younger women coming into the movement in the starting in 1970, particularly after Roe v. Wade, that the abortion issue really emerged as a central political issue for second wave feminism. That is largely the case as women who had been a part of the civil rights movement, part of Black Power, part of the New Left, found contradictions there. I mean, here we're fighting for freedom, fighting for self-determination, and yet men are assuming all the leadership and all the spokesmanships of these movements. And so in some ways, the women's liberation movement was a critique of these other movements that had assumed a kind of male dominance within them. And then finally down in the corner, the gay civil rights movement emerging in 1969. Although there were gay civil rights organizations stemming back to World War II during these years, it's really after 1969 that you begin to see a much more robust civil rights movement emerging out of gay communities within the United States, in this case in Greenwich Village and New York. So these movements, even as they represented breaks with each other, and in some cases were outright hostile to each other. I should say, mention this because rather than you think of Martin Luther King Jr. as somehow the opposite of the Black Power movement, yes, he called Black Power a slogan without a program. It is important to understand that King understood the need for the Black is Beautiful sentiment of the Black Power movement, that in some ways that push for African Americans accepting themselves on their own terms, rejecting the double consciousness of W. Du Bois and seeing themselves as they really were, was something that King ultimately supported. And if you read through King's 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here, you'll hear him say all kinds of positive things about Black Power. So we need to get beyond this kind of dichotomy of, civil rights movement, Black Power movement. There's a lot of overlap between them, and King himself was in many ways an advocate of the Black Power movement. Which brings me to kind of the main point for this particular slide, which is that for all the disparities of these movements, for all the different concerns, they did share a commitment to individual self-determination, or the language that they used was authenticity. I try to press students on, what's the current language for the 1960s? It's authenticity. You'll see that word appearing in the Port Huron Statement. What would be more current words to express that? When I was younger, it was keeping it real. Sorry, I just heard a bell going off, and I was wondering if my computer was breaking down. Students a few years ago told me legit. I guess keeping it 100. I don't know. Maybe you can fill me in on what's the latest language for a person trying to express that they are their own unique selves. They are not conforming in some way to society standards, but they are, they're whatever. They're rebels. They're authentic. They're self-directed. They're self-determined. This was a countercultural, even revolutionary value in the 1960s. I know it's hard to understand because in many ways American culture today is a result of the legacy of these groups fighting for authenticity, self-determination, self-direction, such that everybody prizes, whether you're left or right, everybody prizes individualism today. That was something that was revolutionary in the 1960s. Especially when you read Friedan's book, you'll understand the 1950s was a time of intense conformity, belonging, even a kind of strange collectivism, even if it was a father knows best, leave it to Beaver kind of collectivism, maybe not Soviet collectivism. But there's a strong emphasis on conformity. All of these movements share a commitment to breaking away from 1950s conformity, particularly as conformity led to apathy about social problems, right? It's not like there wasn't racism and poverty and militarism in the 1950s. The feeling was, at least by the New Left, is that people just were scared to do anything about it, were indifferent, distracted. They just want to take these issues up, and these radical liberal movements of the 1960s were united by a commitment to bringing up these issues and trying to address them, but address them in a way that would be honestly therapeutic. Some historians who study this period have called the radical liberal movements a therapeutic radicalism. in that the message of all these movements is, for your own good, not just for the good of the cause, but for your own good, you need to become involved in these movements. For the New Left, you need to become involved in free speech or anti-war or anti-poverty efforts. Whether we're successful or not is in some ways besides the point. You yourself will be transformed as you become involved in these movements. Same with the civil rights movement, right? I mean, for nonviolent direct action to work, African Americans needed to mobilize not by the hundreds, but by the tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions for it to work. And so the implicit message of King, the explicit message of people like Kwame Ture and Ella Baker was, you need to become involved in your own liberation. Whether we end racism or not, for now, whether we end sexism or not, you need to become involved in the cause for your own good. You yourself, at least, will be transformed. And this is in many ways the legacy of the 1960s radical left movements. They didn't end war. They didn't end racism. They didn't end sexism. They didn't end poverty. But they did produce generations of transformed individuals. Most New Left veterans went on to become kind of permanent activists and continuing. A lot of them are continuing to fight their causes today. Tom Hayden is still out there. Kwame Ture is still out there. I'm not sure that Ella Baker is still alive, but a lot of these people who became leaders in the civil rights movement and now in the New Left continue to fight for these particular causes today. So they are in many ways the legacy of the 1960s, showing that becoming involved in your own liberation works. Whether you actually transform society or not, you yourself will be transformed. And so in many ways the legacy of the 1960s New Left is in these individuals who found themselves transformed through becoming involved in efforts to liberate others. This was kind of the message of the 1960s, is the best way to achieve self-determination, authenticity, self-direction, legitimacy, whatever you want to call it, all right? The best way to do this is becoming involved in movements to liberate others, to fight racism, to fight sexism, to fight war. This would be a way to achieve authenticity. And so an emphasis on individualism, in individual self-fulfillment, is very much a legacy of the 1960s. But here's where the radical liberal movements all, starting in the 1960s, but certainly after, have all struggled, is it's really hard to build solidarity on the basis of authenticity, right? Authenticity is about ultimately individual self-direction. As a part here on what statement it would say, finding a way of life which is personally authentic. How do you build a solidarity? How do you build what part here on would call a participatory democracy? How do you build unity on the basis of movements that are founded upon individual self-determination? This is where the 60s movements really struggled at that time, and continue to struggle afterwards, is to build kind of a common agenda. For political movements to be successful, they have to build coalitions. It's been hard for these different movements to build coalitions at that time that lasted, right? The coalition between the New Left, the Civil Rights Movement, only lasted maybe 5-6 years before that fragmented. Coalitions between left men, left women, lasted maybe 6-8 years before that broke down. What you have here is a picture of the Miss America protest in 1968, one of the movements, or one of the events that brought a lot of publicity to women's liberation. I put this picture here both as a kind of remembrance of activities that brought feminism, second wave feminism, women's liberation to the national consciousness. But it also is, in microcosm, shows this larger problem. The women who engaged in this protest in Atlantic City in 1968 refused to work with men. I mean, there were all kinds of men who were wanting to support the feminist movement. These women said, no, we need to do this for ourselves. This needs to be female only. They would only talk to female journalists. They would only be, ultimately, when they were arrested, they would only be arrested by female policemen. Yes, there were female policemen at this time, but interestingly, they weren't allowed to arrest anyone. So take that for what you will. And so the Miss America protest in 1968 highlighted both the emergence of this women's liberation, but also the fragmenting of these radical liberal movements, and kind of showcasing how hard it is on the basis of individual self-determination to build political coalitions, to build a participatory democracy, to build social solidarity on this basis. And so this struggle between individualism and well, they called it at the time collectivism, social solidarity, whatever you want to call that, is also a legacy of the 1960s too. So hopefully that made sense. Again, as you read the Port Huron Statement, try to look for not just the highlights of participatory democracy, the language of authenticity, but places where they stand in tension with each other, and think through on that. And we can maybe have some time to talk about that through an optional Zoom or in your writings. What I'm going to do is break now, and part 2 of this video will be linked up in another place. See you soon.